For Creamer Media's Polity, I am Shannon de Rehove. Author and entrepreneur Gigi Elcock joins me to discuss his autobiography, Third World Child. Your parents, Krina and Neil Elcock, were humanitarians who gave up comfortable lives to move to rural Zululand. They moved two young children to Msinga, one of the most violent places in Africa. Why did they do this?
So it was quite crazy because my father was a very successful farmer. He owned a number of farms and doing very well. And he was brought up by a mother who he was the first child, didn't believe that, didn't realize children were as hard as she expected. So she handed him over to the maid, and the maid brought him up and was in essence like his mother. Mm. And then as an adult, he went to visit this maid and found they were living in terrible poverty. People had malnutrition, and yet he was a hugely successful farmer, and they were doing things like dumping milk into drains to keep the price up, to create a false shortage. And he had this overnight kind of thing of, I can't live this world that actually is a false world, and sold everything, gave everything away, and decided to start a new life doing community work. And that's where he met my mother, who was a journalist who was sent to interview this strange white person who was hanging around with black people, and so he was a bit of a community worker, but also a political activist as well at the time, which was in the kind of middle of the apartheid years. And as part of what they were doing, they believed the only way to really change people's lives was to live like them. And if they were telling people this is what you should do to improve your life, they should be illustrating it themselves. So they literally gave everything away, and they went around looking for the worst possible places that they could find, where people were really in the worst conditions imaginable, whether that was like forced removals, where people were being forced off the land by the government, which is where they started, or to Msinga, where they ended up with incredibly poor arid areas as a result of forced removals. People had been thrown onto this land, overpopulated. So they looked for those kind of places. In fact, someone said to me the other day, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Msinga." He said, "That's the arse end of the world." So that's what they looked for. And those were the poorest people, the most politically disempowered and stuff. And part of living like those people was to literally build a mud hut on the banks of the river. We had no running water, no electricity. My mother taught us at home, and we spent the rest of our days after school every day as local Zulu kids, and my father kind of enforced the fact that we would be treated like every other child, whether that was engaging in stick fighting or being chastised by the local elders. Yeah.
You and your brother Konya were both initially homeschooled by your mother. You grew up as Zulu children, herding goats and playing with the neighborhood children, and also learning to speak fluent Zulu. What is your most vivid memory of your childhood?
Probably what I just described of we had these, my mother, we'd wake up very early and my mother would teach us herself, and we had a couple of hours of schooling on a stone table under a thorn bush, under an acacia tree. But then the rest of the day was spent with the local Zulu kids, herding goats, hunting, trapping birds, stick fighting, literally being, living the life of a typical Zulu child who starts off as a herder in the mountains and is also taught things like hunting and fighting and a lot of the kind of martial skills of a typical Zulu warrior society. It was also a very, it was a place riddled with faction fights and fighting and that kind of story. So people from Msinga always expected to be quite martial and quite aggressive and stuff. So that's kind of part of our upbringing, was this experience of being a typical Zulu warrior. So yeah, I look back on it, and that's really, we were white, but in every single other way. We were barefoot. Our clothes were as ragged as the other kids. We were probably tanned enough to get away with being a lighter skinned Zulu child. And real life as people, and we'd spend nights and stuff in local homes and stuff. So we were literally part of that community in every way.
Rival tribesmen assassinated your father when you were 14. Tell us about this time and how it has affected your life and family. What is your greatest fear for South Africa?
Okay. I think obviously after my father was assassinated, I probably became a lot more politically aware because, he was assassinated by local tribesmen, but to a large extent abetted and supported by local police, both KwaZulu and South African police, who saw him as a threat in that area. He was causing trouble. There was a number of court cases where he'd got local farmers and local policemen into trouble for everything from torture to abuse, etc. So suddenly, there was this realization of the fact that you lived in quite in this world where apartheid was obvious in how these things happened, like political assassinations, I guess. I was also 14, so suddenly at 14 I was forced to kind of head the household. And on one hand, at the time we'd gone to a local government school, so it wasn't a rarefied atmosphere of a private school. It was this typical government school, and the people at school with us were the policemen's sons, the farmers' sons, who were our kind of opponents. It was a whites-only school, and so there was a sense of these really dramatic different worlds where during the week I would be in boarding school in this white school, and in the weekend go back home where I was considered as and now I was the head of a household and respected by the local Zulus, and so kind of forced that, and suddenly also forced your realization of the fact that there's these different societies. The one was this Zulu society, which I was far more comfortable with and felt like was my home society in a way, and culture. And then the white society, which was about rugby and typical kind of white society, which I wasn't comfortable with and didn't feel really part of to an extent, but had to be part of because this was my school and this was my life. I think you asked the fears, my fear for South Africa. So my fear is not probably related to that. I think my fears relate a lot to, I see a lot of people, my life was very much about how it wasn't about color. It was, because here I was a white person and part of an African society, and in the white world I was, ostracized in a way for the Zulu side of things. So my fear is that, it shouldn't be about race, and there's more to it, and my book is a lot about bad black people and bad white people and good black people and good white people, and you can't draw those lines very simplistically. And in the book, there's a lot of people who took advantage of my father's death who were black people who suddenly could take advantage of the situation, and equally there's a lot of white people who came to say, hey, we've got to change things in this environment. So this tragedy about and what in a way our life experience is that it's not about race. And I often I find people saying to me, but you're different. You're white, but you're different. So no, I'm not. I'm white. That's it. You can't add a caveat which says, well, because you speak Zulu, you're not typically white. I'm white. And that's the danger of race-based judgment, and we're seeing a lot of it more and more used for political ends, I think. But it's a tragedy, and that's my fear, is that becomes a strong thing, and that actually we should be moving away from that, because there are these there's a lot of the prejudice and way people behave is not driven by race, it's driven by other things. Yeah.
Ultimately, you were forced to move into the white world, which was largely unknown to you, to complete your high school education. What was this experience like, and how has it shaped you?
What it did in many ways is what I guess, the people I grew up with experienced later on. So, in Msinga, Zulu men, when they, in their teens, move to the city, and they go from this incredibly rural, traditional society, and suddenly are thrust into this modern world, not necessarily a white world, but a modern world, which is about, a completely different world. They talk about Johannesburg as Kwandonga Ziyaduma, which means the place where the walls thunder. And I always have the sense of arriving from this pristine rural area in this place where there's just so much noise, and it must be terrifying. And for me, in a way, that white school, or typical kind of white school at the time, was about entering this white modern world, which we didn't have TV, we had no running water, no electricity, no hot water, and so just even on a basic level, it was this completely. I watched TV for the first time, at the age of 11. I was, I'd seen it, but I'd never really had it available, and so suddenly we were exposed to a modern world, and that was quite difficult because it's culturally there's no rules that you're accustomed to. In a rural environment, you do this is what's wrong, this is what's right. In the modern white world, it's suddenly learning a whole new hierarchy. I mean, just learning the hierarchy of prefects and stuff was a shock to me. I was used to the fact that you had a stick fight and that determined who was the main guys and who weren't. Now you have a prefect and you're carrying his bag and polishing his shoes. Is a startling contrast, but very much moving from different worlds. And I think my experience a lot of the time, and my later life, the advantage was learning how to move between worlds comfortably and say, okay, this is one, now move to the other, which I think a lot of particularly people who come from rural areas like the Zulu people I grew up with, it's very difficult, and they end up moving into that world as a visitor and then moving back into where they're comfortable. Whereas in my environment, I think I became more and more comfortable moving between different worlds. So I could be comfortable in one and the other, and actually see both as part of it and not as a stranger to it. Yeah.
Throughout the book, you do not shy away from the violence and death that coloured your childhood years, surrounded by savage faction fighting. How have these events affected your adult life, if at all?
Yeah. So I think when I was relatively young, we had some people who were volunteers who had come and work, who were a lot of them varsity students and stuff. And so I said to my father, would he send me to varsity? And he said no, he'd never be able to send me to varsity, but he'd prepare me for a life in Africa. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
How, like the violence of your childhood,
that's right.
how did that
so,
affect your adult life?
So, I mean, a lot of the skill he gave me which prepared me for this life in Africa, was understanding language and culture, and being able to, I'm in marketing now, I have the skills to understand, consumer insights and people's behavior and stuff in these places. But another kind of side effect was, or side benefit was that, when you're brought up in the environment, you are brought up, tough, being able to survive physically. So I had a number of other benefits, and more than once I had a hijacking, or I was held up on my bicycle and I had a gunfight with the guys and got my bicycle back, or wasn't hijacked on my vehicle and stuff like that. So I think you get, kind of a mix of skills, which are quite contrasting in a way, and I think people find quite strange, because on the one hand, a lot of them are soft skills, and a lot of them are then hard skills, which again are almost from different worlds.
Your story is one of heartbreak and tragedy, but also of vibrant hope and compassion. What is your hope for South Africa?
So a lot of my experience growing up in that environment is about diversity in a way, and I think that we have an amazing diversity, which is glibly spoken about, but it's a cultural diversity. And I find often I'll meet someone and I'll say, are you Xhosa, because of their surname or their name? And they'll be, how do you know? And then we'll chat about the difference between a Xhosa and a Zulu and stuff, and people will be comfortable with that. And increasingly people are starting to be more comfortable about saying I'm a Xhosa, or being an urban person who believes in lobola, for instance, or respects their culture. And I see in the urban environment, it's revival of African food as an example. You have all these Porsches and Beamers and stuff parked outside a place that offers mahodu, which is tribe. So, and the tragedy is that you've had this whole thing where, as people modernize, there's an assumption that they westernize. And the reality is people don't suddenly, when they modernize, lose their cultures and their traditions. And, a Jewish person who leaves one environment, ends up in New York, remains a Jewish person, or Italian. And Afrikaners are very good at that in terms of many ways. And in the African environment, many people have lost those cultures, or not even lost them so much as been afraid almost to express them or to be proud of them. So, and I'm seeing little glimmers of people. You look at the opening of Parliament. 20 years ago, all the black people there looked just like the Afrikaans people. They wore three-piece suits and crimpoline dresses. And now they're wearing all this African chic, and the vendors wear something Venda, and the Xhosa and so on. So there's almost this kind of reawareness and reawakening of a culture. And I think that's very important in our country because of the diversity, that celebrating diversity is about recognizing your culture. And as an English person, we have no culture. English South Africans are terrible, and we're like an amoeba. We take what we like, like that from the Zulus and that. I tell my kids, I'm taking the cultures that I feel comfortable with. So I insist on lobola because they're very beautiful, and I expect lots and lots of cows. And they say, Dad, you can't pick and choose whether you're a Zulu or whatever you are. But so going back to your question, the hope for me is that that cultural diversity can be, that culture evolves. That evolution of culture means you don't lose it, you modernize it, but that you keep it, and that we can be more proud and more expressive, particularly expressive of our cultures. And that actually represents why South Africa is different. And at the same time, we're almost afraid to express it.
That was author and entrepreneur Gigi Alcock speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about his book, Third World Child.